At exactly 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, a message left the White House that may have just triggered the most dangerous rupture in the US-Canada alliance in nearly a century. While major television networks are still running routine headlines, a 36-hour ultimatum has already been delivered to Ottawa, one that could destabilize over $935 billion in cross-border energy and industrial trade across North America. Washington is demanding the immediate suspension of Canada's newly enacted Arctic Energy Sovereignty Act, legislation that quietly transferred control of nearly 41 trillion cubic feet of untapped Arctic natural gas reserves into a Canadian state-controlled energy consortium. Those reserves sit inside what analysts have long described as the last major undeveloped energy corridor on Earth. If Ottawa refuses to comply before the 36-hour deadline expires, the United States is reportedly preparing a retaliatory economic strategy known internally as the Northern Shield Response. The measures under discussion include emergency tariffs on Canadian crude exports, the suspension of joint Arctic drilling infrastructure, and the freezing of critical U.S. energy technology transfers that Canada's resource sector depends on. At 7:12 a.m., urgent briefings concerning Arctic energy security began circulating among Western strategic planners. That means this confrontation may already be expanding far beyond a bilateral dispute. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Major news networks are still hours behind this story, and by the time their coverage catches up, the geopolitical consequences may already be unfolding. Because what began at 6:47 this morning could mark the moment North America's most stable alliance started to fracture under the pressure of Arctic energy power. In this analysis, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this Arctic energy crisis unfolded, why the timing of this confrontation is so dangerous, and why the 36-hour deadline issued this morning could reshape the balance of power across North America. First, I will break down the three strategic demands Washington has reportedly delivered to Ottawa and why each of them targets the very core of Canada's Arctic energy policy. Second, I will explain the economic chain reaction that could follow if those demands are ignored, including how more than $935 billion in cross-border trade, critical supply chains, and the North American energy market could be thrown into immediate instability. Third, we are going to examine the hidden geopolitical layer of this crisis, the Arctic itself. Because the Arctic is no longer just frozen territory, it is quickly becoming one of the most valuable energy and strategic corridors on the planet. And finally, I will lay out three possible scenarios that could unfold when the 36-hour ultimatum expires, ranging from a quiet political compromise to a full-scale economic rupture between the United States and Canada. If you begin to see how serious this situation really is, press the like button now, because what we are about to unpack next reveals why this crisis may have been building for months behind closed doors. To understand why this confrontation escalated so suddenly this morning, we need to break down the crisis step by step, because what looks like a sudden diplomatic clash is actually the result of three structural pressures that have been quietly building for months beneath the surface of Arctic energy politics. Let's start with the first factor. Condition 1, control of the Arctic energy corridor. For decades, the Arctic was treated as a distant frontier, remote, frozen, and largely inaccessible. But new geological surveys over the past several years have revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the Arctic seabed lies an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and nearly 30% of its untapped natural gas reserves, according to assessments frequently cited in energy policy circles. That is precisely why Canada's Arctic Energy Sovereignty Act triggered alarm in Washington. The legislation effectively consolidates control over Canadian Arctic gas fields into a centralized national consortium, dramatically limiting the role of foreign energy corporations that previously expected access through joint exploration agreements. For the United States, this is not just a commercial issue, it is a strategic one. If Canada consolidates full control over Arctic extraction routes, it could gain leverage over one of the most important emerging energy supply zones on the planet, and that is where the economic stakes begin to escalate. Condition 2, the $935 billion economic pressure point. The United States and Canada share one of the largest trading relationships in the world. Every single day, roughly $2.7 billion worth of goods and energy products cross the US-Canada border. But energy sits at the center of that relationship. Canadian crude exports, particularly from Alberta, supply a significant portion of the oil refined in the American Midwest. Meanwhile, the United States provides critical technologies, investment capital, and infrastructure support that Canadian energy companies depend on. The problem is that this interdependence cuts both ways. If Washington moves forward with the reported Northern Shield response, it could disrupt pipelines, technology sharing, and energy financing arrangements that have taken decades to build. Economists who study cross-border energy systems often warn that even small disruptions between the two economies can create shockwaves across the continent. In this case, the scale being discussed is anything but small. A disruption approaching $935 billion in trade exposure would represent one of the largest economic confrontations ever seen between two allied countries. And this brings us to the third and perhaps most dangerous factor. Condition 3, the strategic militarization of the Arctic. Over the past decade, the Arctic has quietly become one of the fastest evolving strategic theaters in global geopolitics. Melting ice is opening new shipping routes. Previously unreachable energy deposits are becoming accessible, and countries with Arctic territory, including Canada, the United States, Russia, Norway, and Denmark, are all positioning themselves to secure long-term influence. Military analysts have increasingly warned that energy security and territorial control in the Arctic are beginning to overlap. Former NATO commanders have repeatedly pointed out that whoever dominates Arctic infrastructure, ports, energy extraction platforms, and transport corridors could shape the next generation of global energy flows. This is why emergency briefings reportedly began circulating among Western strategic planners shortly after the ultimatum was delivered this morning. Because once Arctic resource control becomes a geopolitical contest, it stops being just an economic negotiation. It becomes a matter of national security. And that is why the current crisis is sending such powerful signals through diplomatic circles. When major allies begin issuing ultimatums over energy sovereignty, it suggests that the underlying competition for strategic resources may have already reached a breaking point. Some economic voices have already begun warning about the consequences. Veteran investor Warren Buffett, speaking previously about geopolitical energy tensions, once warned that resource conflicts between advanced economies can trigger economic chain reactions that markets underestimate until it is too late. Similarly, several energy economists have cautioned that disruptions in Arctic supply development could alter global natural gas markets for years. Now imagine those pressures colliding with a 36-hour diplomatic deadline. That is the situation Washington and Ottawa now appear to be facing. And if you're starting to see how many layers exist inside this crisis, energy control, economic leverage, and strategic security, press the like button right now. Because what we've just examined explains why the next 36 hours may determine whether this confrontation cools down quietly or expands into one of the largest economic ruptures ever seen between two Western allies. Now everything comes down to the clock. The 36-hour deadline issued this morning is not just a symbolic diplomatic gesture. It creates a hard strategic window in which both Washington and Ottawa must decide how far they are willing to push this confrontation. And when that deadline expires, three very different futures could emerge. Let's walk through them carefully. Scenario 1. Full compliance. Canada backs down. In the first scenario, Ottawa decides that the economic risk is simply too great. Under intense pressure from business leaders, provincial governments, and financial markets, Canada could agree to temporarily suspend the Arctic Energy Sovereignty Act and reopen negotiations with U.S. energy firms. This would calm markets almost immediately. Cross-border energy flows would stabilize, joint Arctic exploration agreements could resume, and both governments would likely frame the outcome as a strategic adjustment rather than a political defeat. But even in this scenario, the damage would already be done. Because the mere existence of the ultimatum would expose just how fragile the energy balance between the United States and Canada has become. Trust inside the alliance would be weakened, and future Arctic negotiations would unfold under a cloud of suspicion. Scenario 2, partial concession, a fragile compromise. The second possibility is a middle ground compromise. Canada could maintain the Arctic Energy Sovereignty Act, but agree to carve out special access provisions for U.S. energy companies, allowing them to retain partial involvement in Arctic gas development. On the surface, this would look like a diplomatic victory for both sides. Washington could claim it protected American energy interests, while Ottawa could argue that it preserved national control over Arctic resources. But this outcome would create a much deeper strategic question, because once Arctic energy access becomes negotiable, every future decision about pipelines, drilling licenses, and export routes would become part of a larger geopolitical bargaining process. In other words, the Arctic would transform from a cooperative frontier into a permanent arena of strategic negotiation between allies, and that could generate long-term instability in global energy planning. Scenario 3, total breakdown. The energy alliance fractures. The third scenario is the one that policymakers fear the most. Canada refuses to alter the Arctic Energy Sovereignty Act. The 36-hour deadline expires, and the United States moves forward with the Northern Shield response. If that happens, tariffs, technology freezes, and suspended infrastructure projects could begin triggering a cascade of economic reactions across the continent. Energy markets would immediately react, investors would start reassessing North American supply chains, and global competitors would quickly recognize an opportunity, because the moment two of the world's closest economic partners begin weaponizing energy trade against each other, the ripple effects extend far beyond their borders. Europe, Asia, and global energy traders would all begin recalculating their long-term supply strategies, which means the next 36 hours are not just a diplomatic deadline. They may be the moment that determines whether North America's integrated energy system holds together or begins to fracture in ways that reshape the global energy map. Right now, the clock is ticking. The 36-hour ultimatum delivered at 6:47 a.m. this morning has already set something much larger in motion than a simple policy disagreement. What we are witnessing could be the beginning of a profound shift in how power, energy, and leverage operate inside one of the world's most stable alliances. For decades, the United States and Canada have been seen as the backbone of North America's economic and security structure. But when energy sovereignty collides with strategic dependency, even the strongest alliances can begin to show fractures. If the deadline expires without compromise, the consequences will not stop at the border. Energy markets will react. Investors will react. Governments across Europe and Asia will start recalculating their assumptions about the stability of North American supply chains. In other words, the global energy map could begin changing in real time. So now the question turns to you. Do you believe Washington pushed too far with a 36-hour ultimatum over Arctic energy control? Or did Canada knowingly trigger a geopolitical confrontation by locking down one of the most valuable untapped energy corridors on the planet? Leave your perspective in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to stay ahead of stories like this as they unfold, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next 36 hours could decide whether this crisis cools down or escalates into something far bigger.